and welcome to the first ever episode of She Investigates. I'm your host, Gwen Ross, and I am so excited to be recording my first episode. On this podcast, we are going to be investigating all things weird, whether that's a murder, a disappearance, conspiracy theories, and yes, even aliens. Today, we're unraveling one of Japan's most infamous unsolved crimes, the Setagaya Murders. But first, let's catch up. In the future, this segment is going to be a few minutes before we jump into the case for me to just kind of chat about things that are going on in my life. But since today is my first ever episode, I thought that I would start off by introducing myself a little bit. I have been listening to true crime and mystery podcasts religiously for like the last 5 years. It's how I get stuff done around my house. I would just throw on a podcast and do some dishes or fold some laundry. And every now and then I would kind of toy around with the idea of starting my own. But it always just seemed really overwhelming and really time consuming. And let me explain why. I am a mom of 3 kids, and up until just this last year, I always had at least one kid home with me during the day. But since August, all of my kids have been in school all day, and suddenly I have these 6 wonderful hours every day all on my own. So I've been trying to kind of find myself again, find my hobbies, but after being a stay-at-home mom 24/7 for 11 years, it's actually been really challenging. So when the idea to finally start the podcast that I had dreamed up so many years ago came back to me, I decided, you know what, it's now or never. I'm just going to do it. So I want to thank everybody for listening and helping me with this kind of passion project of mine and helping me to become an armchair detective just for 1 hour a week. And with that, let's jump into today's case. On a cold December night in the year 2000, the Miyazawa family, a family of 4, was brutally murdered in their home in Setagaya, Tokyo. What makes this case so perplexing isn't just the horrifying nature of the crime, but it's the chilling details that were left behind by the killer, who remains unidentified to this day. Who could have committed such a heinous act and why? Let's dive into the facts, theories, and unanswered questions surrounding this haunting case. Setagaya is a quiet residential area of Tokyo. The Miyazawa's family home sat just behind a popular skate park, and it was one of the last houses remaining in this area. The area was actually slated for redevelopment, and this skate park was hoping to expand. Families in the area were being paid to leave their homes to make way for this expansion, and the Miyazawa family was one of only 4 families that remained in this kind of dying neighborhood that was once home to over 200 families. They themselves had plans to leave the area in just a few months. The family consisted of Makio, 44, his wife, Yasuko, 41, and their 2 children, 8-year-old Nina and 6-year-old Ray. And by all accounts, they lived a pretty typical suburban life. They were known to be kind, hardworking, and just a very close-knit family. Makio worked at a marketing firm, while Yasuko was a beloved teacher. Nina enjoyed soccer, ballet, and was very active. Ray, the youngest, was struggling at the time with a speech impediment, and the family was actually seeking help to help him treat that. But on December 30th, 2000, their peaceful existence came to a violent and unimaginable end. Now, their home, it was not a typical home the way that it was set up. I'll try to kind of describe it to you. It was set up more like a duplex, and that allowed for Yasuko's mother to live right next door in kind of the secondary unit of the home. So it was on the morning of December 31st, 2000, that around 10:30, Yasuko's mother started to kind of become concerned. She hadn't heard from the family, and she'd been trying to call them, but she couldn't even get the call to go through. So she finally decided, I'm just going to head over there to their part of the house and check on them. And what she found was nothing short of horrifying. When she knocked on the door, nobody answered. Because she lived in the other part of the house, she had a key. The door was locked, but she let herself in just to make sure that everything was okay. It was then that she discovered that all 4 members of the Miyazawa family had been brutally murdered inside their home. Makio, the father, had been stabbed multiple times and was found at the base of the staircase. Yasuko and Nina were found upstairs, also stabbed repeatedly. And then lastly, 6-year-old Ray was found strangled in his bed and was cold to the touch. She desperately tried to revive her family, but it became obvious to her pretty quickly that they were already gone. The level of violence was staggering, and it suggested one of 2 things. This was either a deeply personal rage or just a completely unhinged attacker. Officers were called to the scene immediately. And while the crime itself was just, like I said, completely horrifying, the details that were left behind at the crime scene by the killer are what makes this particular case so just chilling. The perpetrator didn't flee immediately after committing the murders. Instead, they lingered in the Miyazawa home for hours, leaving behind a trail of baffling clues. Honestly, when I read this story, it kind of seems like the killer just had no fear of getting caught at all. They made no attempt to clean up. They made no attempt to dispose of evidence. They just were not afraid of getting caught at all. And that's what makes this case so weird to me, is that there is so much evidence left behind, and yet, like I said, it's still unsolved. One of the first pieces of evidence that the police found was upstairs. There was a dresser that the drawers had been pulled out of. And one of the drawers had been taken into the bathroom, dumped into the bathtub, and then the bathtub was filled up with water. Also in this bathtub was a bloody white towel and bloody sanitary pads with all of the stuff from this drawer. And the police are thinking that the towel and the bloody sanitary pads were used by the killer to clean up their own blood and not the victim's blood. And that's because, like I said, there was no attempt anywhere else in the house to clean up any of the blood from this attack. So the police are thinking that the killer most likely hurt themselves during the attack and was using these items to clean up their own blood, not the blood of the victims. The next thing was weird is that in this case, there was 2 murder weapons, 2 knives that were used for the stabbings. And I'll explain later why there's 2 of them, but both of them were just there sitting out in the open in the scene of the crime. The police didn't even have to really look for them. They were just there waiting to be collected as evidence. The killer also ate ice cream from the family's freezer. There was 4 ice cream wrappers that were found. And from what I could tell, a lot of what I learned about this case was in Japanese and had been translated. So it was hard to kind of know for sure. But from what I could tell, the wrappers were from like novelty ice cream, like popsicles or an ice cream sandwich, that type of ice cream. And I know what you're thinking. There's 4 wrappers and there's 4 members of the Miyazawa family. How do we know that they didn't eat the ice cream before they were attacked? Well, easy. When the wrappers were processed, there were fingerprints that were found on these wrappers that did not belong to any of the family members. Also, during their autopsies, ice cream was not found in any of their stomachs, leading the police to believe that these were consumed by the killer. After that, the killer took a nap on the family couch. I mean, this is just savage. This killer comes in, kills a family of 4, strolls into the kitchen, has a little ice cream snack, and then decides to take a snooze on the family couch. Like, that's pretty unhinged. They also used the family computer to browse the internet, and they even attempted to make a couple of purchases. After the police looked over the computer, they were able to determine that the internet had been used at 2 different times. The first was at 1:18 a.m., and the second was at 10 a.m. And that 10 a.m. one is more interesting to me than the 1:18 a.m. one. That's because if you remember, Yasuko's mother, when she came over, it was around 10, between 10 and 10:30. So if this attacker had stayed even 30 minutes longer, they were in serious danger of being caught. The internet was used just to visit bookmarked websites that the family had bookmarked, and then the power cord itself had been disconnected. Also spread out on the floor was the family's bank cards and their IDs. It looked like somebody had been sorting through them, and there was an attempt to make some purchases on the internet, but I couldn't find anything that ever said that any purchases actually went through. There was bloodstains from the killer that were found all throughout the house, and that was another thing that indicated to the police that the killer had injured himself or herself during the attack. There was footprints all over the house, both in dust and in blood. Now, this next piece of evidence is really strange for me. There was clothing that was left behind by the killer, and not just like one or two pieces. We're talking a lot of clothes. And they were not just left scattered about the house, they were neatly folded. I'm going to tell you everything that was left behind by this killer. There was one gray bucket hat, one black AirTech jacket, a white and purple long-sleeved shirt. In some of the information that I found, it was called a sweatshirt at times, and in other places it was called a long-sleeve shirt. The best way that I can describe it is that it looked like a baseball tee with like the solid white torso and then dark purple sleeves. They also found black Edwin gloves, a multicolored scarf without any tags, which was popular among the junior high and college age kids around that time, and also a black handkerchief, which had been ironed. Now, this is so weird to me because one of two things. Either the killer stripped off all of this clothing at the crime scene and just decided to leave it there, or they brought all of this with them and left it behind on purpose. Neither of which really makes sense to me. They also left an olive green hip bag. More on this later because this ends up becoming a big piece of evidence for the police. It looked kind of like a fanny pack or like a bag that you would wear around your hips when you go like hiking, like an outdoorsy type bag. Like I mentioned earlier, the front door was locked and there was no broken windows. Yasuko's mother had to use her key to get in because the door had been locked. But upon further investigation, the police found that the screen from the bathroom window had been taken off, and there was a flower pot on the ground that was broken. So they're assuming that that was the place of entry for the killer. Lastly, there was a scent at the murder scene, and it wasn't the kind of scent that you're thinking. It was the scent of a popular cologne, and it was very popular at the time among skateboarders, which, if you remember, the Miyazawa family lived just behind that skate park. So that was an interesting clue for the police as well. Now, I left the last piece of evidence for last for a reason, because this is just the icing on the cake, the cherry on top, if you will. The perpetrator left behind their own feces in the upstairs bathroom, seemingly just completely unbothered by the thought of leaving DNA evidence. Now, I don't know about you guys, but when I'm out and about and I'm at a store or I'm at a restaurant and nature comes calling, I will try to hold it until I get home because it can be uncomfortable to take care of business in public. But obviously this killer had no problem with that. They, killed a family of 4, ate ice cream, took a nap, used the computer, and then to top it all off, took care of business before going on their merry way. That is just so strange to me. So one of the first things that investigators tried to determine when solving this crime was when the crime occurred. The family was said to have been seen shopping the night before around 6:30 at a local shopping center. And then Yasuko spoke to her mother on the phone around 7 o'clock. Her daughter Nina went next door to watch a TV program with her grandmother at around 9:30. And then the last activity that was recorded in the house was an email being opened, and that particular email actually required a password. So they're thinking that that had to be somebody in the family using the computer at that point because they wouldn't have been able to open the email without that password. And that was around 10:38. A few of the neighbors reported hearing loud noises around 11:30, which is probably close to the time when they were killed, and the police believe that what the neighbors hearing could have even been the attack itself. Now, I mentioned earlier that Ray was killed in a much different way than the other family members. He was strangled in his bed, and there was no evidence that there was any other type of weapon that was used to kill him. And the police think that that's because they were trying to keep little Ray quiet and not alert anyone to somebody being in the home that was not supposed to be there. Yasuko and Nino were probably killed in or near the attic. Their bodies were actually found on the second floor near the bathroom, but they found some blood evidence to suggest the attack started actually up in the attic. Some of their wounds were inflicted post-mortem, which is another thing that is strange to me. It could either be one of two things. It could either be somebody who is so filled with rage that they just kept going and going and going even after the women had died, or somebody who just wanted to make sure that they were actually going to die. Maybe somebody who was committing a crime that they hadn't committed before, who had never done this before, and this was their first time. After the autopsies, their official cause of death was listed as blood loss due to puncture wounds. And this didn't really help them determine the time of death at all. It was kind of a dead end as far as that goes. The crime scene, like I said, was just this treasure trove of evidence. And yet the case is still unsolved today. It seems like this killer just threw caution to the wind when it came to covering their tracks. As the crime scene was processed, both DNA and fingerprints were found at the scene. There was blood all over the house, all over the knives, and my first thought when I read this was, how do they know that that is the killer's blood and that it's not the family's blood? Well, the blood was tested, and the blood type was type A, which did not match any of the members of the Miyazawa family. There was fingerprints found all over the house as well, and on those ice cream wrappers, and those didn't match anybody in the family as well as in the Japanese criminal database. Now, in Japan, they have a fingerprint system, like a identity system, kind of like we have here in the United States with that have criminals that you can match prints against to see if you get any hits. But the system in Japan has 1.3 million DNA profiles, and that was as of August 2020. So this person, they ran the prints and the DNA against this database, and there was absolutely no hits. So had this person just never been caught for any of their past crimes, or was this their first crime? Based off of two things, I don't think it was their first crime. Number one is the brutality. If this is your first crime, you're going to be more hesitant. You're going to be more skittish. You're not going to be committing as brutal of a crime as what we're seeing at this crime scene as your very first crime. Secondly is the amount of time that they stayed around in the Miyazawa home. That is somebody who is experienced. That is somebody who is not concerned about getting caught, is not concerned about what they're doing. That is somebody who I believe has committed multiple crimes and has probably just never been caught before. Now, I mentioned the murder weapons that were also found at the scene of the crime, and the wounds on the father were made from a sashima knife. And that type of knife was actually available to purchase at that time from that shopping village that the family had been at the night before. And the attack was also committed using another knife. It appears that the tip of the sashima knife had broken off in the back of the dad's neck during the attack. And the perpetrator resorted to finishing up the job with a knife that was just from the family's own kitchen. And that knife was also left behind. Let's talk about that clothing that was left behind. They were able to trace some of this clothing that was left behind to a specific retailer in Korea, but as it turns out, that brand of clothing was also sold in Tokyo at that time. Some of the clothing suggested that there may have been some type of a military connection. I wasn't able to find very much information on that, so just keep that in the back of your head. Now back to that green hip bag. I didn't know that this was even possible, but inside that green hip bag, they found sand. And apparently, you can run tests on sand to find the origin of where that sand potentially came from. So that's what they did in this case. The sand was tested, and you are not going to believe where this sand originated from. The Nevada desert. possibly near an American air base. Now, does that go back to that military connection I just told you about? They also found a powdered red dye on the bag and on the shoes. Couldn't find anything about if that was tested or not, but the straps on this bag were pulled particularly tight, suggesting that this might have been a thinner killer, maybe perhaps under a 30-inch waist. The Miyazawa family's neighborhood had been relatively quiet that night. Like I said, a lot of people had moved out. There was not that many people still living there, which is kind of the perfect place to commit a crime if you're planning to get away with it. One witness saw a man walking near the Miyazawa home hours before the crime, wearing clothing that matched what the killer left behind. And then one other witness reported seeing a car parked nearby with its engine idling, but the driver was never identified. So for me, both of these reports from the neighbors are kind of just dead ends because we don't have any way to really follow up on them. They're just ID reports. Despite the overwhelming amount of evidence, this mystery is still unsolved, like I said. The international nature of the clues, ranging from Korea all the way to Nevada, it really just deepens the mystery. And over the years, there's been a lot of theories that have come up about what actually happened. So we're going to talk about a couple of those. I'm going to go over a couple of the most prominent theories. The first is that it was just a random attack. Some people believe that the killer was just a drifter, possibly mentally unstable, who just chose the Miyazawa family at random. In months leading up to the attack, there was a string of attacks on some of the local animals in the neighborhood. It was mostly rats and cats. I read a story about a cat that had disappeared for a little while, and when it showed up again, its tail had been cut off. And as we all know, animal cruelty can be a sign of psychiatric disorders. So, did somebody that lived close to the family get tired of animals and took things just a step farther and committed this crime? The lack of a clear motive does support this theory, but it also doesn't really explain the extraordinary amount of time that the killer spent in the home. The only way that I feel like that can be explained is if this person were mentally unstable and wanted to stay around in the home as some sort of either power play or kind of like, the best way that I can describe it is like playing house. Like they're eating the food. It's kind of like a Goldilocks and the Three Bears kind of story. Like they just go and eat the food and they sleep in the bed and, you know, all that kind of stuff, which would really only, I think, be appealing to somebody who is perhaps mentally unstable and playing out some type of fantasy. The next theory is that it was a targeted hit. Some people speculate that the Miyazawa family was targeted possibly due to a dispute or a grudge. Makio, the father, had reportedly clashed with some of the local skateboarders in the park that was just right behind their house. But it's unclear if that could lead to such a brutal crime. To me, it was just simple arguments, maybe about the noise, maybe about what they were doing at the skate park, not something that would lead to this brutal of a crime. Not to mention, I talked about in the earlier evidence that one of the pieces of clothing that was left behind was a handkerchief, and that handkerchief had been ironed. Now, how many skater boys do you know that are carrying around a handkerchief in their pocket, let alone an ironed handkerchief? To me, that just doesn't fit. Another possible motive would be robbery. In one of the articles that I read in Japan Today, an officer working on the case said that several 100,000 yen are believed to have disappeared from the family home. Now, I don't know how he would know that, but I'm guessing that it's based off of the family account book that was found at the house. Maybe that amount had been logged into the book, but was not ever able to be located either in the family's bank accounts or at the home, and so they assumed that it must be missing. Obviously, some people believe that there was some type of foreign military connection from the sand that's all the way in Nevada and the clothing in Korea. It's led people to believe that the killer had ties to either the U.S. military or the Korean military. But as of now, no direct links have ever really been established. This last theory is the theory that I believe is the most probable and has the most evidence that backs it up. There was a very prominent investigative journalist in Japan who wrote a book called The Setagaya Family Murder Case, 15 Years On, The New Facts. It was released in December of 2015, and it was written by, like I said, this investigative reporter named Fumiya Ichihashi, which hopefully I didn't just murder those names. But what he thinks happened is that a hitman, possibly a former member of the South Korean army, is the one that killed the family. The clues point to the killer being from Korea in a couple of ways. The first is the DNA. The DNA that was tested has this one specific marker, and that specific marker occurs in 1 out of every 13 Japanese people, 1 out of 10 Chinese people, and 1 out of 5 Korean people. So statistically speaking, they're more likely to be from Korea. Not only that, the footprints that were around the house, the shoes that made those particular footprints were made in South Korea. They were sold in Japan, but the particular size of this shoe that made those prints was never sold in Japan and was only ever sold in South Korea. There was also soil deposits from the scene that were traced back to a province in South Korea that was right near the capital. Once the crime was committed, did the suspect just leave the country? If this particular theory is to be believed, the hitman could have just left after the crime was committed. Maybe they weren't even a Japanese citizen. That would explain why they really didn't have any fear of getting caught, because they weren't planning to stick around to get caught. They were going to hightail it out of there. They wouldn't even be around when the crime was discovered. So that leaves the question, why would a hitman have been hired to kill this seemingly innocent family with no real dark secrets in their past? Now, I mentioned before that the neighborhood was kind of dying off and that families were being paid to leave their homes in order to make way for this development of the skate park and to become more of an industrial area. And it is said that the Miyazawa family had been paid up to 1 million yen. This author thinks that Yasuko mentioned the money to a man that he refers to as Mr. K. Mr. K then hired an assassin to kill the family to get his hands on this money. The trigger man in the book is referred to as Mr. R, and the author says that he knows who this man is. In the book, he only ever refers to them as Mr. K and Mr. R, but he says in the book, he knows who these people are. Now, it was kind of hard to sift through information about this book because this book was written in Japanese. Obviously, with a name like Fumiya Ichihashi, he was Japanese, and it was written in Japanese, and it was never translated into English. So everything that I was able to learn about this book, I learned from an article in Japan Today. But the author claims that he knows who this guy is, and not only that, he claims that he was able to get Mr. R's fingerprints and then match them against fingerprints that were at the crime, and that they were a match. Now, how he was able to get both Mr. R's fingerprints and the fingerprints from the crime, I don't know, because like I said, I wasn't able to actually read the book. And we don't know if the Japanese police ever looked into this or not. Like a lot of true crime books, the author was kind of critical of the police investigation. He talked about a lot of things that could have been done better, things that were missed. And so we're not really sure if the police ever took his theory seriously. But if he really does know who committed this crime, Mr. R, who had been hired by Mr. K, and the police are sitting on that, then they need to do something about that. They can't just sit on that information. Okay, so I'm going to kind of go over just the profile of the killer. So far we know from blood tests and DNA tests that the killer is male, has type A blood, is from East Asian genetic heritage on the father's side, so that means either Japanese, Chinese, or Korean, and the mother's side has roots in Europe, the South Mediterranean area, so that's like Croatia, Montenegro, Albania. In the United States, we would take all of that genetic information and we would have somebody draw a composite sketch so that we could get that out to the public and potentially find who this killer is. In Japan, that unfortunately is illegal. They can make a sketch, but they are not allowed to distribute the sketch to the public when it's based off of DNA and it's not based off of like an eyewitness account or anything like that. So if they ever made a sketch, they were not allowed to distribute it to the public. So I don't know how helpful that was. As of December 2020, 280,000 different investigators and police officers have followed up on this case, and they've been following up on over 13,000 tips. This, to me, might explain why it's still unsolved. 280,000 people is just an insane amount of people to be working on the same case. I mean, I understand investigators come and go, they move to different precincts, people retire, but 280,000, like, it's hard for me to even wrap my mind around that number, that there was even that many different investigators and police officers in the area that could work on the case. But everybody who could basically did. Now, more than 2 decades have passed since the Setagaya murders, and it's still one of Japan's greatest unsolved mysteries. A lot of the police officers that have worked on this case, I'm assuming that have worked on it extensively, not just like passing through working on it. Once they retire, it's the case that they can't let go. It's the one that they still work on even though they're not technically an employee of the police department anymore. They just can't let it go and work on it in their free time because they want to get it solved that desperately. The family has also not stopped their search for justice. For the Miyazawa family relatives, the pain of not knowing who committed such a horrific act or why is a wound that can never truly heal. Now, this was interesting. As I was researching this, I found a new article in the Japan Times that was published just a few weeks ago on December 14th. And they are renewing energy into this case. They had 50 police officers in Tokyo hand out flyers near the home of the Miyazawa family. And they did that because the case is reaching its 24th anniversary. They also set up a mannequin, and they dressed the mannequin in all of those clothes that I told you about earlier that were left behind. The police are also offering a reward of 20 million yen, which is about 128,000 US dollars, for any useful information. So if you have any information that could help solve this case, please contact the Metropolitan Police Department, Saijo Police Station. Thank you so much for joining me for today's episode. The Setagaya family murders are a stark reminder that even the most seemingly normal lives can be shattered by unexplained violence. If you guys have any thoughts or any other theories about this case, I would love to hear from you on my social media. I'm still getting things up and running, but you can find us on Instagram at SheInvestigatesPod, all one word, on TikTok at SheInvestigatesPodcast, and on Facebook just by searching She Investigates Podcast. And then next week, we're going to be exploring the case of the ghost blimp, which is super interesting. You're not going to want to miss it. Until then, I'll be snooping so you don't have to. This is She Investigates, signing off.